What happened in that courtroom 3 years ago would destroy Cole Boaldin's career forever. But when Grace Ward walked in that Tuesday morning, nobody could have predicted the perfect revenge that was about to unfold. The Millbrook County Courthouse was buzzing with its usual morning energy. Grace Ward adjusted her simple navy blazer and checked her worn leather briefcase one last time. At 32, she'd been practicing law in the small Connecticut town for 8 years, handling everything from property disputes to minor criminal cases. Her office was above the local bakery, and most days she could barely afford the rent. But today was different. Today, she was facing Boaldin and Associates, one of New York City's most prestigious corporate law firms. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Charles Freeman," announced the bailiff. Grace stood alongside her client, Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, an elderly widow fighting to keep her family farm from being seized by a development corporation. Across the aisle, Cole Boaldin commanded attention in his $3,000 suit, flanked by 2 junior associates carrying expensive briefcases. Cole Boaldin was everything Grace wasn't. Harvard Law Review, 6-figure retainer fees, a corner office on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his Italian leather shoes gleamed, and his confidence filled the room like expensive cologne. "Your Honor," Cole began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to winning. "This is a simple matter of contract law. Mrs. Patterson signed the agreement. The corporation has every legal right to proceed with development." Grace had spent weeks preparing her defense, researching property rights and environmental regulations. She'd found several precedents that could protect Mrs. Patterson's farm. Her hands trembled slightly as she organized her notes. Judge Freeman nodded toward Grace. "Miss Ward, your response." Grace stood, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Your Honor, I believe there are several environmental concerns that invalidate." "Objection!" Cole interrupted with a dismissive wave. "Your Honor, I apologize for interrupting, but Mrs. Ward seems to be confusing environmental law with wishful thinking." A few chuckles rippled through Cole's side of the courtroom. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, but maintained her composure. "Mr. Boaldin," Judge Freeman said firmly, "please allow Miss Ward to present her argument." "Of course, Your Honor. Though I suspect we'll be here all day if we entertain every small-town legal theory." Grace continued her presentation, methodically laying out her case. She cited relevant statutes, presented evidence of environmental violations, and demonstrated clear procedural errors in the original contract. Her argument was solid, well-researched, and compelling. But Cole was relentless. At every turn, he interrupted with condescending objections and theatrical sighs. When Grace mentioned a Connecticut environmental statute, Cole actually laughed. "Your Honor, with all due respect to Mrs. Ward's creative interpretation of the law, this statute doesn't apply to commercial development contracts. Perhaps if she'd attended a real law school instead of Hartford Community College's night program, she'd understand the distinction." The courtroom fell silent. Grace hadn't attended Hartford Community College. She'd graduated from University of Connecticut Law School, but Cole hadn't bothered to check. The insult hung in the air like smoke. Grace's hands stilled on her papers. Her voice remained calm, almost gentle. "Your Honor, I'd like to continue with my environmental impact analysis. This is painful to watch," Cole muttered to his associate, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Some people really shouldn't practice law." Ayanna Bailey, the court reporter, glanced up from her stenotype machine with a look of disgust directed at Cole. Even Judge Freeman's jaw tightened slightly. During the lunch recess, Cole cornered Grace in the courthouse hallway. Stephen Phillips, his junior partner, stood beside him with an amused smirk. "Look, Grace, may I call you Grace? I'm going to give you some free advice. You seem like a nice girl, but this isn't summer camp. This is real law, with real consequences and real money at stake." Grace listened silently, her green eyes steady on his face. You're embarrassing yourself in there. Your client deserves better representation. Hell, the legal profession deserves better. Why don't you do everyone a favor and find a new career? Maybe real estate. I hear they're always looking for friendly faces to show houses. Stephen chuckled. Cole's right. Some people just aren't cut out for this level of practice. Grace's voice was quiet but clear. I see. I've been practicing law for 15 years, Cole pressed on. I've never lost a case like this. Never. You know why? Because I understand how the real world works. This small town David and Goliath nonsense might play well in local newspapers, but it won't win you cases against firms like mine. Grace nodded slowly, as if considering his words carefully. That's interesting perspective. Smart girl. Look, I'll make you a deal. Convince your client to settle for 50% of the corporation's final offer. I'll put in a good word with some local firms, maybe get you a paralegal position somewhere respectable. But this career path, he gestured toward the courtroom, it's not for you. Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, not sarcastically or angrily, but with genuine warmth. Thank you for the advice, Mr. Boaldin. I'll certainly think about what you've said. Cole seemed surprised by her gracious response. Well, good. I'm glad we understand each other. When they returned to court, Grace's presentation was different, more focused, more confident. She systematically dismantled the corporation's case, presenting evidence of fraudulent environmental assessments and procedural errors that Cole's team had missed. But Cole recovered quickly, using his experience and connections to counter her arguments. The case dragged on for 2 days, with Cole growing increasingly aggressive and dismissive. Your Honor, he said during closing arguments, I've practiced law in courtrooms from Boston to San Francisco. I've never seen such a desperate attempt to manufacture a case out of thin air. Grace's arguments are the legal equivalent of fairy tales. Grace's closing was simple and direct. She spoke about justice, about protecting people's homes, about holding corporations accountable. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. Judge Freeman ruled in favor of the corporation. Grace had lost.
Cole packed his briefcase with theatrical satisfaction. As he passed Grace's table, he leaned down and whispered, "Better luck in real estate, sweetheart." Grace shook Mrs. Patterson's hand, apologized sincerely, and gathered her papers without a word. She walked out of the courthouse into the gray October afternoon, her head held high despite the defeat. 3 years passed. Cole Boaldin's life had only gotten better since that day in Millbrook County. He'd made senior partner at Boaldin and Associates. His client roster included Fortune 500 companies and international corporations. He'd moved to a penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park and bought a house in the Hamptons. He'd forgotten all about Grace Ward and the little courthouse in Connecticut, until Tuesday morning when everything changed. Cole was reviewing contracts in his corner office when Stephen Phillips burst through the door, his face pale. "We have a problem," Stephen said, dropping a legal brief on Cole's mahogany desk. "A big problem." Cole glanced at the document. Myers versus Boaldin and Associates. He frowned. Merrick Myers? Our pharmaceutical client? Former client, Stephen corrected. He's suing us for legal malpractice. $60 million. Cole's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. "That's impossible. I handled Myers personally for 2 years. We saved his company millions in FDA compliance issues." "Look at the signature line," Stephen said quietly. Cole's eyes traveled to the bottom of the brief. The opposing counsel's name made his stomach drop. Grace Ward, attorney at law. "This has to be a mistake," Cole muttered, but his hands were already shaking slightly as he flipped through the pages. The case was devastating, meticulous, brilliant. Grace had discovered that Cole's advice to Myers Pharmaceutical had been catastrophically wrong. The FDA compliance strategy Cole had recommended wasn't just ineffective, it was illegal. Myers had followed Cole's advice for 2 years, unknowingly violating federal regulations and putting thousands of patients at risk. But that wasn't the worst part. Grace had documentation proving that Cole had known about the regulatory violations 6 months into his representation, but had covered it up to protect his fee arrangement. Internal emails, billing records, witness statements. She had everything. The malpractice case wasn't just about money. It was about potential criminal charges for conspiracy and fraud. Cole's phone rang. The caller ID showed Myers Pharmaceutical. Merrick, Cole tried to keep his voice steady. Don't call me Merrick. You destroyed my company, Cole. 20 years of building Myers Pharmaceutical, and your incompetence brought it all down. Now, wait a minute. The FDA is investigating us because of your advice. We're facing criminal charges because you told us those compliance shortcuts were legal. You knew they weren't. Cole's mouth dried. Merrick, we can work this out. Let's talk settlement. Settlement? Merrick's laugh was bitter. I'm past settlement, Cole. I want justice. And apparently, so does Grace Ward. The line went dead.
Over the next week, Cole's world collapsed with surgical precision. Grace had built an airtight case that exposed years of corner cutting and ethical violations at Boaldin and Associates. The malpractice suit triggered investigations by the New York Bar Association, the FBI, and 3 federal agencies. Cole tried calling Grace's office repeatedly, but she never took his calls. 2 weeks later, Cole found himself in a small conference room in Grace's law office, the same building above the bakery where she'd worked 3 years ago. But the office had changed, expanded, professional, successful. Grace entered wearing a sharp charcoal suit, her confidence unmistakable. Gone was the nervous small-town lawyer from that courthouse. This was someone who'd earned her authority. Mr. Boaldin, she said pleasantly, taking a seat across from him. Thank you for coming. Cole's expensive suit felt too tight. His voice cracked slightly. Grace, we need to talk. This lawsuit, it's based on misunderstandings, technical issues that can be resolved. Oh, I don't think there's any misunderstanding, Grace interrupted gently. Your emails to Myers were quite clear, especially the one where you wrote, "The FDA won't catch this if we're careful. Just keep quiet and bill them for compliance work." Cole's face went white. You can't use privileged communications. Actually, I can. Attorney-client privilege doesn't protect communications that further criminal activity. You should know that. Grace's smile was warm, almost sympathetic, though I suppose they didn't cover that in your Harvard classes. The next hour was the longest of Cole's professional life. Grace methodically destroyed every argument he made, countered every excuse, and blocked every escape route he tried to find. Her preparation was flawless, her strategy brilliant, and her execution ruthless. What do you want? Cole finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace leaned back in her chair. Justice for my client, accountability for your actions, and maybe, she paused, that same gentle smile playing at her lips, maybe for you to think about what you said to me 3 years ago. Cole's hands trembled as he reached for his water glass. About a paralegal position? About finding a new career, Grace said softly. About how some people just aren't cut out for this level of practice.
the silence stretched between them like a chasm. The New York Bar Association will vote on your suspension next month. The criminal investigation will take longer, but my sources suggest the evidence is compelling. Cole tried one last desperate play. Grace, please. I have a family, a mortgage. This will destroy everything I've built. Grace's expression didn't change. That's unfortunate. But as you once told me, this is real law, with real consequences and real money at stake. Cole left the meeting knowing his career was over. Within 6 weeks, he was suspended from practicing law pending criminal investigation. Boaldin and Associates lost clients, faced multiple lawsuits, and eventually dissolved. Cole's penthouse was foreclosed, his Hamptons house sold to pay legal fees. 6 months after their meeting, Cole was working as a compliance consultant for a small insurance company in Albany, making $40,000 a year. Grace Ward, meanwhile, had expanded her practice to include corporate law and opened offices in Hartford and Boston. The Myers case had established her reputation as one of New England's most formidable attorneys. She kept the original office above the bakery, though. It reminded her of where she'd started and why she'd never stopped believing in justice. On quiet afternoons, when the scent of fresh bread drifted up through the floorboards, she'd sometimes think about that day in the Millbrook County Courthouse, about Cole's condescending smile and his advice to find a new career. She'd learned something important from Cole Boaldin that day, that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting angry.
Sometimes it's getting better. And sometimes, if you're patient enough and work hard enough, you get the chance to prove that small-town lawyers can play at any level, especially when they're fighting for something that matters. Grace never sent Cole a thank you note for the motivation, but she did send him a copy of her bar admission certificate when she was sworn in to practice before the U.S. Supreme Court. The note attached was simple. Thank you for the career advice. Grace Ward, attorney at law. By then, Cole was selling insurance in a strip mall in Albany, still paying off his legal debts and still learning what it felt like to be underestimated. Some people, it turned out, really weren't cut out for this level of practice. Just not the people he'd expected.